I'm Sarah Handy. I'm the co-chair of Herd and Rye this year, along with Emily Zanios. Herd and Rye is a committee of volunteers representing local schools and other organizations in and around Rye. We work to assemble a series of lectures throughout the year to educate our community on various aspects of parenting. We're very fortunate tonight to have a wonderful guest speaker, Claire Lerner, to talk with us about understanding and supporting big reactors in highly sensitive children. So one or two small housekeeping items before we get started with the talk. Claire will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have a question for Claire, please use the Q&A function that's either at the bottom of your screen or potentially at the top of your screen. Please don't put questions in the chat is the main point, as all the questions that will be shared with Claire will be drawn from the Q&A function instead. With that, let me now turn it over to our moderator for this evening, Denise Wooden. Denise is Director of Community Impact and Social Responsibility at the Rye YMCA. She's also a member of the Herd and Rye Steering Committee. So thank you very much for moderating tonight, Denise, and thanks again to all of you for being here. Denise?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Emily and Claire. I'm delighted to welcome Claire Lerner to our community virtually tonight. Claire is a nationally recognized child development and parenting expert with more than 3 decades of experience in education and direct practice. She partners with parents to decode their children's behavior and solve their most vexing child-rearing challenges. She also trains pediatric residents in child development and parenting and provides mental health consultation in DC area preschools. In addition to her clinical work with families, Claire led the parenting division of 0 to 3 for 20 years. She is the author of hundreds of parenting resources, including books, blogs, podcasts, and videos, including a regular blog she writes for PBS Kids. Her most recent book is Why is My Child in Charge? A Roadmap to End Power Struggles, Increase Cooperation, and Find Joy in Parenting Your Young Child. We are delighted to have Claire with us tonight. Claire, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Denise and the team at Herd and Rye. I'm going to share my screen so that you guys can see my presentation. So Denise, you just want to give me a thumbs up since you're the only person I can see. Can you see my, okay, perfect. Yes. Okay. As Emily shared, the topic for tonight is understanding and supporting big reactors in highly sensitive children. I am going to take us through a series of what I think of as guiding principles when it comes to understanding these feisty kids, because I find that once parents have new mindsets and a foundation to go from, they're able to respond to their way in the most sensitive, loving way that they set out to be, but sometimes is really, really hard to do, especially when it comes to big reactors. So I'm going to start by grounding us in one of the most important factors in being a sensitive, responsive parent before I dive into the whole temperament factors that we're going to focus on tonight, which is that all behavior has meaning. And when parents have this perspective, it puts us in a mindset of, rather than judging our children's behavior, into understanding and getting curious about the why of what our children are doing. So when it comes to understanding the meaning of our children's behavior writ large, it's very helpful to think about it as an effort to cope. So it may not be a great coping mechanism and something that we obviously have to work on, but nonetheless, it's serving a purpose. And if we can understand what the purpose of the behavior is, it makes it much more likely that we'll be able to respond in a way that's much more meaningful and effective, because we're actually addressing the root cause, right? So if you've got a really clingy child, who's holding on to you for dear life when you're taking them to preschool in the morning, it's very important to understand what is underlying that. Or is there a new baby at home? Is the child going through a fearful stage? Have they just, gone through a pandemic? And is this their way of saying, this is a scary experience for me? Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to send them to school, but if you see it as a signal and a signal that we need to respond to and support, it's going to put you in a frame of mind that is much more effective than sort of our typical reactivity. And I would say, as a parent of 2 grown children and working in the trenches with families all day long for 30 years, like that is the killer. It's the reactivity for all of us, because it's so triggering to be a parent. We care so deeply about these kids that we get very triggered when they're struggling or when they're doing something that we feel is not a healthy behavior for them. And we get reactive in ways that actually make it hard for us to be the parent that our child needs us to be. So you're going to hear a lot about that tonight, because it's especially important when it comes to dealing with kids who are big reactors and highly sensitive. So another example might be a kid who's biting, right? So kids are not a monolithic group, and behaviors don't all have one meaning. You can line up 10 kids who are biting, and there might be 10 very different reasons for that, right? So one of them could be that they're actually a very sensory oriented kid, and that's soothing for them. Like those are the kids that just want to bite into something because it actually calms their sensory system, right? Biting, I see this quite often. I'm in preschools a lot of hours a week, and often a child may bite because they feel very uncomfortable with kids in their space. And so that's a very effective way of keeping kids at bay. So again, it's not that biting is a good thing, but once we understand that, we can then support that child to deal with the underlying issue, which is slowly helping him or her feel comfortable with kids sharing their play area, right? Another good example is a lot of the kids I work with are very rigid and inflexible, and we'll get much more into that later tonight. But for many of those kids, it's just maddening to parents because it can be insane the way they can become so rigid. Like, you cut their sandwich on this diagonal instead of this diagonal, and they're having an epic meltdown, even though it's the exact same peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But it's because these are often kids who are wired to have very fixed ideas about the way things should be. And when something happens in a way that they don't expect, it's very, very triggering for them. And so we'll get more into this later, but I think this is a very important foundational sort of guiding principle to keep in mind when you're trying to understand why your child's doing what they're doing. Okay, so there are 3 key variables. So when I'm working with families, I'm doing the detective work. I'm guiding families through a process to understand the meaning of their behavior. And the way we do that is by looking at 3 key buckets, which is development, temperament, and context, the environment in which children are functioning in. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to walk us through those. So the development piece is basically like what the age and stage is that your child is at. Right? So is this a time where we expect heightened, separation anxiety? We know 3-year-olds and really 4 and 5-year-olds too are famous for being desperate for control over their world, and they'll take it wherever they can get it. And so that's where parents are often starting to deal with pretty significant power struggles. If your child's, let's say, in elementary school, they may be struggling with sort of wanting to be independent, but also really needing you. So it's very important to tune into, like, where is my child at developmentally, both emotionally, but also are there developmental factors we have to take into consideration? So if your child, let's say, has not even a motor delay, but just like that's not their thing. They're much more in their head. They're not really physically, that's not what's getting them excited and engaged in the world. And so now they're on the playground, and maybe there's some playground challenges because this child is not able to do what his peers are doing, right? So that would be the developmental piece of the puzzle. And then we want to ask ourselves, how is this affecting their behavior? What piece of the puzzle is the development aspect of it? The next one that we're going to be honing in on deeply tonight is this concept of temperament, which I think of as the why of behavior. So development is sort of like the what of behavior. What is your child doing? They're sitting up, they're crawling, they're saying this many words, they're thinking, they're building these cognitive skills as they grow. It's what they are doing. Temperament is really the why of behavior. It explains why some kids like jump into new situations without looking back, and other kids, like I said before, are clinging to dear life. Or some kids have incredible frustration tolerance and they never give up, and then you have kids who the second they face a challenge are just melting down and falling apart. You have kids who have very high activity levels and kids who are much more sedentary. These are all temperament traits that impact how your child experiences the world and therefore how they respond to it, right? So it's the why. It's something that we are all born with. This is a constitutional factor. It's not something children chose or that you created as a parent. And it explains why many of you who have children who may be very different temperamentally, it explains why, even though they share some DNA, they may have completely different reactions to their experiences in the world. So you have one kid who you could easily correct, no problem, where your younger child is melting down the second you give him like the slightest direction. So it's very, very important to tune into the temperament. And that's, again, a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. And then the final factor in understanding behavior is context. And that is the piece of what is going on in the child's world. And what impact is it having on their behavior? So this could be a move, new siblings, a parent out of town, losses, even relatives coming to visit, even though that in many ways is positive for kids. Any big change is still a stressor, even if like you see it as positive. And so like putting it all together before I move on to really do a deep dive into the big reactors and highly sensitive kids, I'm thinking, for example, the child I'm working with who is 3, and he's just gone off the rails. Like he's just being super defiant at home. He is not able to, manage any of the tasks or transitions. He is having a very low frustration tolerance, and his parents are, going insane, as you might imagine. So when we put these pieces of the puzzle together, here's how we understood it. One is that he's 3 developmentally, and he's all about control. So as soon as something happens that he doesn't expect, he's already primed to be triggered by that, and to draw them into power struggles. Temperament is a huge factor for this kid because he is a highly sensitive kid. He's a very big reactor. And so that's another big piece of the puzzle in understanding his behavior. And the context is just an insane amount of change in this child's world. Actually, even beyond COVID, the family was doing a renovation. They lived in many different people's houses. Then they traveled all summer to finally see family they hadn't seen. And then they came back, and that was really the culmination. It was like he had met his threshold for stress and he was just off the rails. So once we understood all of those factors, we were able to put a plan in place that helped support him. And a lot of those strategies you'll see as we go through the presentation. And I will say that my new book is all about this. It's just going through case after case of the challenge parent came in with, some of the mindsets that were at play that I'll get to, how we made a plan once we understood what was going on, and what the solution was in all of its messiness. Course corrections we had to make. In that way, it's sort of the anti-one-size-fits-all book. It's really seeing how other families, sort of muscled through and puzzled through sleep, tantrums, power struggles, physical aggression, all sorts of the, boilerplate bread and butter stuff we all deal with. And the process that I took these families through so that other parents reading this book who I could never see or may never see have a roadmap for what this might look like and how they can apply that to their own, child and family. Okay, so now let's do our deep dive into highly sensitive kids. So here's the deal. These are the kids who, like I was one of them, and, was, called Sarah Bernhardt. I was an overreactor. I was thin-skinned. I was too sensitive. And that was what we used to think, right? That it was like a choice we were making, and that we were purposefully being oversensitive, and that we just had to get a grip. Well, the good news is now that there has been a ton of research on temperament, we know that there are kids who come into this world wired to register their feelings and experiences in the world more deeply than other children. And many of you may know about the work of Thomas Boyce. It's phenomenal. And if you don't know it, you should check it out. And I have the reference below. He put it in a way that I just think made it so relatable for so many parents. These kids are orchids. They're affected by and reactive to even minor changes in their environment, just like an orchid, right? So an orchid is like too much sun, too little sun, too much water, too little water. You touch it the wrong way, and there's like a big reaction. And that's what it feels like to be these highly sensitive kids. They tend to be highly sensitive both to emotional things like changes, transitions, being told no, but also from a sensory perspective. And we don't have time to get into that tonight, but I will say that if you have a big reactor, a kid who's sensitive, often there's also a sensory piece of this puzzle, meaning that I find many of these kids may be overreactive to sound. They may be very picky eaters because they're overreactive to textures in their mouths or smells. These kids often have, sort of are the kids who have a hard time with clothes because things just feel uncomfortable to them. So these kids are more vulnerable because they are so deeply affected by the world around them. It's almost like they don't have a filter. It's like everything comes through. Unlike the kids we think of as dandelions, who are the kids who, like a dandelion, a dandelion will thrive anywhere, right? Like dry conditions, no sun, too much rain. These are kids who are just sort of the go with the flow. I think of them as the whatever kids. And I also think of them as the kids who just make their parents look so good because they're like, time to leave the playground, no problem. Time to do your homework, no problem. They're just chill by nature. And so they tend to have less challenging behaviors because they don't get stuck in like thinking so deeply about something to the point where they get themselves into a tizzy, right? So when we talk about kids who are slow to warm up a little bit later, which is very often, those kids are often highly sensitive because they're processing so much. It's like their brains never turn off. So now they go to a new school or a birthday party or a new, swim class or a soccer class. And they don't just like, oh, this is so fun, the pool, and jump in. They're thinking like, what is this water? And who are these people? And is this teacher going to be nice? And am I going to like the other kids? And are they going to be better than me? So these kids who are highly sensitive, they don't have an off button, and it makes them amazing. They are the most passionate, intense, empathetic, delightful children, but at the same time, they also really struggle with managing their emotions because of not having this filter. Okay, so here's some of the key sort of, attributes of highly sensitive, big reacting kids. So first of all, they're triggered to experience stress much more quickly. They get overwhelmed by their very big emotions. And so naturally that results in more meltdowns. They develop all sorts of coping mechanisms in order to gain control of a world that feels like way too much to manage a lot of the time. And we'll get into this later, but that's where you see a lot of that rigidity. That one way to feel in control and to impose some order on the world is to have very, very rigid ideas, like only grandma picks me up from school. So then when mom shows up, they're triggered because it wasn't what they expected, and they have a very hard time managing them when things don't happen the way they want. So you see, like, they come by it honestly. And I focus on this so intensely because these kids need a ton of empathy. They need us to acknowledge that their feelings are really big and sometimes they're really overwhelming. It doesn't mean we don't set limits. We're going to get into that, but it's very, very important to keep reminding yourself that they're not like working your last nerve on purpose. Okay, so here are some very common challenges for big reactors. We've talked about the emotional regulation. They often have very low frustration tolerance. They are often, like I said, very inflexible. They are often very anxious about new experiences and have difficulty with transitions. And a lot of kids, and I will tell you that I'm seeing this more and more, well, I don't even know if we can say post-COVID, but whatever stage we are in COVID, with perfectionism. And if you think about it, all of these challenges are rooted in control issues, right? Is that these kids are triggered very, very quickly to feel out of control. So where like a dandelion or a more go with the flow kid can sort of like tolerate stress until they reach their threshold and maybe break down. It's not like those kids never break down, but it takes, they can manage a lot more before they get to their breaking point. These kids, like, I don't know if you guys can see me, but their starting point is like here, right? They're already sort of revved up by nature. And so they reach their threshold. And remember, they don't have that filter. So it's just building. And therefore they are triggered to feel out of control more quickly. And then you get a lot of these challenging behaviors. So I'm going to start with some, oh, actually, right. I actually have a video. By the way, these parents gave me permission, because I just find it incredibly helpful for you to see in vivo sort of what this looks like, or many of you who have a kid like this are going to feel very validated, but I show it now because I'm going to use this little girl and family as an example of how I help support parents who have big reactors. Okay, so this is actually a 3-year-old, and the setup is that she flips out every night at bedtime trying to get her blankets just right. Okay. And here is the video of her mom, unbelievably like a saint, so patient and so calm, trying her best to satisfy her daughter's need to have her blankets just so. So I'm just going to show you a little of it. It goes on and on, but it's kind of hard to watch, and we also have limited time. Okay, so I think you guys get the point, but by the way, this went on, when they first sent this to me, this went on for 20 minutes, and absolutely nothing this mom did worked. And the more she tried, the more revved up and dysregulated this child got. So we're going to loop back to this, but I just want to show you sort of like, this is very typical that this child, like, she is out of her mind at this point and nothing is going to be right. And that is very typical for kids when they've met their threshold. And we're going to talk about sort of how you respond in these moments a little later on. So the overarching guiding principles are, just to keep in mind as we get into the weeds, is that what we're aiming for is to avoid threats, shaming, frustration, and anger. And I name these because these are all the typical reactions that most parents are having when they come to see me, when they are really struggling with a big reactor. And the reason, may be obvious, but threats and shaming and frustration and anger only flood kids' brains more and cause more dysregulation. So it's just not strategic, because as they're escalating, and there's a lot of neuroscience on this, that as kids are escalating, if the parent escalates alongside them, it only exacerbates the situation. Plus, it sets in motion negative narratives for these kids about themselves, and it rarely sort of ultimately solves the challenges these parents are trying to solve. So I know we all agree with that. I probably, nobody listening to this at 7 o'clock at night after a long day like thinks that these are good ideas. It's just that in the moment, most of us are triggered to react this way. The goal is how to be responsive and not reactive, and that's, I hope, what you'll hear from me in the next 20 minutes or so. So it starts with making some mind shifts. And I think I mentioned before that my book is actually like the foundation of it are some of the mind shifts you're going to see here, because as I work with families, and as you might imagine, like many don't come who have dandelions. Most of them have big reactors. And what I found in my work with families was that as I peeled back the layers of these very tricky moments with their kids, was that there were a series of mind shifts that, like, the lens through which parents were reacting to these situations that were leading to intense power struggles, and not to the solutions, the loving solutions they were looking for. So here are a lot of them that come up for families when they're dealing with the big reactors. So one is that children are not misbehaving on purpose. Many times as I work with families, when they come in, they feel at a gut level like their child should know better. They should have more self-control. This is really especially tricky when you have kids who are like 3, 4, 5, because they will tell you, like, they know objectively, like, we don't hit, we don't push, we stay in our rooms at bedtime, we don't throw food, on the floor. But when they are triggered, their downstairs brain has taken over. And in that moment, they actually, like, their feelings are almost always going to override what they know to be right or wrong. They don't intend to misbehave or drive you crazy. So many of the times they're actually, the impulses have taken over and they don't mean to misbehave. That doesn't mean, remember, we don't set limits, but if you go into scenarios with your kids, no matter their age, and see it that they're misbehaving on purpose, it puts you in a much more harsh, punitive state of mind that actually leads to more challenging interactions and not a lot of problem solving. The other thing I would say is that children have learned behaviors. Like, they may learn that, if I have a meltdown in the middle of Target, I'm going to get the unicorn I've been begging mom for that she said no to. So they're just being strategic, and it's not misbehavior. And so it's the job of the parent to be able to manage that moment, seeing it as, it's my job to help my child learn to manage and live through this moment of not getting something that she wants. And you're much better able to do that if you are not, like, hating on your child in that moment and think that they're, like, purposefully mortifying you in the middle of Target. Really, they either have learned a behavior and it's worked, and so they're relying on it, or they've literally just lost control and their downstairs brain has taken over. Okay. The next mind shift. Children don't always mean what they say or do. And this is a biggie with these highly reactive kids, because this is what happens on a daily basis in my practice. I hear stories like this. I took his tablet away and he said to me, a quote, "Daddy, I'm going to stick my hand down your throat, pull out your voice box and throw it away. I don't like what you're saying." So obviously this child had just learned, about voice boxes. And of course this dad is triggered and he feels like he has to teach his child a lesson and punish him by schooling him on how he can't talk to his dad that way. The problem is multiple. One is that if the child is angry and revved up and looking for a reaction to yank your chain, then getting that reaction only reinforces that behavior. Plus, they're trying to usually derail you off of whatever, limit you were trying to set. Plus, it's very dysregulating to the child because they don't mean it. They're just triggered. And when you take it at face value, the kids get very flooded with emotion and shame, especially when they do things like hit you or scratch you or bite you. because they don't really mean it. So when you react in a way that that signals that you think they're purposefully trying to hurt you, they get so flooded with emotion that their whole prefrontal cortex, the front part of their brain that actually helps them think about their actions and learn self-regulation, is completely flooded, and there's no learning can take place. So it's actually much more effective to not respond to the vitriol and sit, and like in the case I'm telling you with the dad, is to just say, I know you're really mad at dad right now. It's tablet time is over. I don't expect you to like it. I don't expect you to agree with my rule. That's a daddy rule. That's my job. And you move on. And that is the reason that is so much more of an effective strategy with these kids is, first of all, it's totally empathetic, totally get it. Why would you like my rule? It is not a revved up reaction. So it's much more calming to that child's nervous system. You're not making it a relationship issue. You're not making it like you hurt my feelings. You're making it a limit setting opportunity, which is exactly what it needs to be. So let's say your child's doing something physical, which is, especially triggering. The problem with, saying, oh my, why are you hitting mommy? Mommy's not going to want to play with you. Why would you want to hurt mommy? Again, flood of emotion and shame is a very toxic emotion, and it shuts kids down. And once they're shut down, there is no learning. And I would argue that all of us, what we really want is learning. We really want these kids to learn to use their words, right? And to not use their bodies, but it's a process. And if you can do something more like this, oop, no hitting, we don't hit people, human beings have feelings, let's go help you find something else to hit. It is much more effective because you're not shaming your child. You're not saying you think he's a terrible person who's purposefully trying to be violent. You are setting a clear limit and giving him a healthier way to express his emotions. So don't take their reactions at face value. They do not mean what they say when they are in those triggered moments. Okay, next, feelings are not the problem. So this is what I mean by this is that when highly sensitive kids are experiencing big feelings, what I find is that the knee-jerk reaction for most parents is to rush in to sort of cheerlead or minimize or, oh, don't worry, you'll see grandma again when your child's, screaming on the floor because grandma's leaving, or they don't want to go to school and you start saying, oh, but you love school and they have a million more magnet tiles than, we can ever afford to have at home. We get so uncomfortable with their discomfort that we do things that actually minimize or try and talk our children out of their feelings. The problem is the feelings do not go away. What happens is they get bigger because they don't have an avenue for expression. And they also inadvertently get the message that you're uncomfortable with their feelings. So they're less likely to bring those feelings to you. And trust me, as your kids grow, your greatest currency is that they're going to feel comfortable coming to you with their big feelings, and that you are going to validate and understand and not try and minimize or invalidate or talk them out of their feelings, right? So what you want to be doing is something like this. So I've got a lot of kids now of all ages who are really hedging going to school, right? Going back to school has become very stressful for certain kids, often the more highly sensitive kids. And the second our child says, I don't want to go to school, I hate school, we get anxious and we start trying to talk them out of it, or just saying, or just glossing over it and sort of, forcing them into the car to go to school without any chance to really work through the feelings. It's much more effective, and kids learn to manage their feelings when they have a chance to be validated and look at them objectively without being judged. So you want to be completely agnostic about their feelings. Their feelings are not the problem. It's what they do with their feelings that can become problematic, right? Like now they have a stomach ache or they have a headache because they haven't had a chance to work through what the challenges are of going to school. So in this model, it would be something like this. I know, sweetie, going to school just some mornings can feel really hard. I totally get it. Tell me more about that. And you air them, and it's probably for another talk, but you go into how you talk to kids about what the issues are, what they can do, strategies to take to school with them. But at the end of the day, you're still setting that limit. So the message is, feelings are, I'm there with you on the feelings. I totally get it, but school is a have to, and I'm going to help you find those coping mechanisms. But you don't want to miss that piece of validating the feelings, because it's much less likely they're going to act out on those feelings if they've had a chance to air them and to look at them and not feel ashamed of their feelings. Okay, the next is a biggie. Okay, so this is one of the most humbling things that nobody warns you about when you become a parent, which is that you actually have no control over your child. Like, they are human beings. What comes out of their voice, what they do with their bodies, is only up to them. And it's the sooner you acknowledge that and absorb that, the better, because it helps you to focus on what you can control, which is the situation. The more you try and control children, usually, especially with these highly sensitive kids, the more they dig in their heels. And so the more you try and cajole, bribe, reward, threaten, the more dysregulated the whole situation becomes. Because if you think about it, if you're trying to control your child, you're trying to get them to sit at the dinner table, you're trying to get them to go on the potty, you're trying to get them to agree to go to school, the outcome of that interaction is completely dependent on your child being like, oh, it probably is a good thing to end stories and books now, because my mind and my body really need to get a good night's sleep. Like, in 33 years of practice, I've never seen a kid do that. So if you're predicating your whole strategy on getting them to change their mind, you're going to be in what I call the gray zone, no man's land, and a lot of frustration and anger at your kid for not getting with the program. What you really want to be doing is focusing on controlling the situation, right? So it's not like, get in the car seat. If you don't get in the car seat, there's no Paw Patrol later. Or, if you don't do your homework, you're not going to be able to, go outside and play for 5 days. Because what if your child says, oh, I don't care about that, and then they just walk away from the homework, or they don't get into the car seat? You need an end game. And that's where I have a model that I use, which is like sort of what I call 2 great choices, right? So with the car seat situation, it's simply this: Bud, I totally get it. It's hard to go from home to school, and you're having a really hard time getting into the car seat. No problem. You have 2 great choices. You can be in charge and you can get to the car seat on your own. If you choose not to, I'll be a helper. I'll help you into the car seat. It may be a little uncomfortable because, I may be picking you up and you may not like it and you may be kicking and screaming, but that's my job. That's my daddy job, is to get you to school on time and me to work on time. And then you just do it and you move on like nothing happened. No vitriol, no anger. It's just your child's having a hard time in that moment and you help them move along. So again, I know there's so much more to be said on these topics, but for time, I'm going to keep moving on. But this is something very important. The first thing you should say to yourself when you're in a tricky situation with your child is, what in this little scenario in front of me do I control and don't I control, right? So you can't make a child, let's say, stay in their bedroom at night. Like, if they can motor out of their room, then that limit is not a helpful one, because you have no power to actually implement that limit. That's why I find, and this is going to raise a lot of questions, and it's not a sleep talk, but I actually find almost all the time that providing a boundary is the most loving thing you can do, because then bedtime becomes, you have control, you're in charge in a loving way, and you can stay calm and loving because you have an end game, and you're not like walking on eggshells wondering how many times your child's going to come running out of the room and how extended into your very precious evening that's going to become. Okay, so another mind shift is, and this is also like, you can start to see how they're all interconnected, but it's that limits are loving. Happy children are not always happy. Okay, that's so important to keep reminding yourself. It's the boundary that is what helps kids adapt and become more resilient. This is especially true for the highly sensitive kids. And one of the really tough things is that they need those limits and boundaries the most, and they're the hardest to set them with because of how fierce they are and how forceful they will push against your limit. I talk to parents all day with like literally 3-year-olds that are talking their parents in circles. But remember, 2 weeks ago, you said if I did this or that or this, that I would get another half hour of TV, and the parents are like completely, their heads are spinning, and they like are CEOs of companies, but at home, their child is completely in charge because they've lost the boundary. Boundaries are as important for parents as they are for kids. So you know where the limit is. And so you can stay in charge in a loving way. Absent the clear boundary, interestingly enough, that's when parents get mean. Like they're usually avoiding setting the limit because they want to avoid the tantrum and they want to avoid feeling mean. But actually, when things go off the rails because there is no clear boundary, that's when parents become mean and angry and hating on their kids because of how frustrated they feel. So this is really, really important to remember, that the limit is loving, and don't expect your child to like the limits, right? I've never heard a child say, thank you so much for limiting screen time so I can do more edifying things with my mind and my body. You really want to get comfortable with these kids saying, I know, you're really angry. It's so hard to turn off the TV. I don't expect you to like my rule. I'm not asking you to like it. That's the limit. And if you need to be unhappy, no problem. It's your mind and body. If you need to be unhappy, no problem. I'm going to go in the kitchen and I'm going to make some lunch, and I can't wait for a helper when you're ready. Okay. And this leads me to another very important mind shift, which is that tantrums and meltdowns are not inherently harmful to children. The distress they experience when they can't get what they want when they want it, it's what helps them adapt to important limits. It's that distress is normative. It's just their way of saying, I'm having a hard time right now accepting that I can't get that unicorn, that you're not going to stay in the room and sing me 10 more songs. It's like I said, it's what's harmful to kids is when there is no boundary and they naturally exploit that gray zone. And 5 more minutes, 10 more books, please just lie down with me, I haven't had enough time with you today. When the boundary isn't clear, kids are going to, like I said, not misbehave. They're just doing what's in their DNA. And I'm talking about kids of all ages. If there's an opening for them to push their agenda, they are going to do that, and they're not misbehaving. It's up to us as the parent to say, I know, sweetie, you know what? It's never going to be enough books. It's never going to be enough cuddle time. I totally get it. But our rule is that lights are out at 8:30 or 9 o'clock. And I know you don't like that, but I have total faith in you that you will be able to get your mind and body to sleep. So if you're the reason I made this a mindset is because when I do the detective work with parents to figure out why things are going awry, often it's because they are really at a cellular level doing anything to avoid the tantrum. And if that's your MO, you're going to find yourself in these protracted power struggles. And that's what's harmful to kids. It's not the limit. When you stick to a limit lovingly because you're in charge and you know where that boundary is, that's when you can stay calm and loving. And that's what these kids need most. Don't assess a limit based on your child's reaction. I've already really commented on this. You have to keep reminding yourself that just because a child doesn't like a limit doesn't mean it's not good for her, right? Okay, so here are 3 rules of thumb when you're dealing with a challenging situation in the moment. I would always start with validation, and you've heard me do that a lot. There's a very important scientific reason for that, which is that the neuroscience shows that just validating your child's emotional experience is calming to their nervous system. And like I said before, it also builds their EQ, their emotional intelligence, and all behavior is rooted in a feeling. So the more children are able to have those feelings validated and put on the table and accepted, the better able, as they grow, they're going to be able to look at those feelings and the actions that emanate from those feelings and be able to make some positive changes. Because remember, guys, only your child can do that. Right? They're having issues on the playground. They're one of those really controlling kids who's really bossy and you're really concerned about them. Telling them to stop being bossy or nobody's going to want to play with them rarely results in change. It's just shaming. They get the message that you're unhappy with them, that you're judging them, and there's no learning. You want to say, wow, that's really tough. You have really strong ideas about what you want to do on the playground. Let's see how that's working. And you just put the feelings on the table. You tell the story of what happened, then your friends didn't want to play because, they wanted to be the princess too. So how did that work? Is there something else you want to do differently? That's when children are open to making more positive choices, but it always starts with validation. Remember, focus on what you control, which is you, not on trying to get your child to change. That's where saying, I know you want to come out of the room. Our rule is that kids stay in their room so their mind and bodies can get to sleep. And so Mr. Door Helper is going to help you do that. And as an aside, I have so many parents who have very strong knee-jerk reactions, right? They're like, I'm not locking my child in their room, which I totally get from a visceral level. But if you think about it, most kids were in a crib for 2 to 3 years. They were essentially locked in their room, and parents loved it because it provided that boundary that enabled the child to adapt. They didn't have the in and out and all of that intense ugliness that goes on when you're like dragging your child back to the room. And now they're like, you're hurting me. And then you're like, oh no, we're hurting him. And then he's back in your bed. Like the whole thing gets lost. So you really want to focus on validating the child's feelings, not trying to convince them to like your rule, and to set a limit that you actually have control over. And then I've already mentioned this, make sure the limit you are setting, you have the power to implement. So for example, like telling a child to stop yelling is not a helpful limit because you're leaving it totally up to them about whether they're going to choose to stop yelling or not. Remember, like that goes in the category of things you don't control, what they come out of their mouths. But what you can say is, if you need to yell, no problem. But in this is our group space, this family room. And so there's no yelling here because it's uncomfortable to other people's ears. So you have two great choices. You can talk in an inside voice, or you can yell in your room all you'd like, no problem. It's not punishment. It's just like, those are your two great choices. That is something you as a parent have the power to implement. So you don't want to get stuck in that gray zone where you're just trying to like threaten or bribe your child into like getting with the program, because often I've seen these kids say, oh, I don't care about whatever rewards you're offering me. And they just continue doing what they're doing. And then you're nowhere. Okay, so I'm very aware of the time. I think I may actually just stop here. I don't know. I can take the temperature, Denise. I've got a few more slides on how to deal with, with some of these emotional regulation issues and inflexibility. Maybe I'll just take like 3 more minutes and then I'll stop just to show you guys some more of the content. And then, I'm going to be sending out a lot of follow-up resources for you to see. So maybe we'll just take 3 more minutes to do that. So I've already talked about how to help with emotional regulation, not interpreting or reacting to kids at face value. When it comes to remaining calm, the thing I suggest to parents, because this is really the biggest issue in the moment, is I find it very helpful to just like sportscast and say what's in front of you and buy yourself a minute to think about, what do I control in this situation and not? And what are the two great choices here? So it might be like, oh, I've asked you to turn the TV off, and I see you're having a hard time following that direction. I'm going to take a mommy minute to think about how I'm going to help us solve that problem. It can be very calming to you. And I will tell you, I see a lot of kids actually immediately complying because they're sort of like freaked out about you not getting revved up and reactive and being very calm yourself. So you're also modeling being calm, which is also a very important factor in kids learning how to get calm. To build frustration tolerance, I will just say very quickly, position yourself as your child's problem-solving partner. Do not solve their problems. And this means getting comfortable with their discomfort. So the way this looks is something like this. Your child's freaking out over a puzzle and hurling, puzzle pieces across the room. It looks something like this. I know puzzles are really frustrating. They're really, really hard. I know. And it's really uncomfortable right now that you can't figure it out. Totally get it. Total validation. I have some ideas about how we might solve this problem. Would you like to hear them? This asking permission, I find, is a critical step not to miss, because if you run right in with, oh, you can do this or you can do that, first of all, you're becoming the problem solver. And often these kids are already so revved up that they start saying things like, stop telling me that. Like they just get even more out of control. So you want to give them a pause, give them some space, and then ask if they'd like your help thinking it through. But what you don't want to do is keep running to the rescue, because what you're communicating to them then is that you don't believe in them, that they can solve their own problems, that only you can solve their problems. And by the way, that means that you are always then to blame when things don't go well. So that's frustration tolerance. Flexibility. This is a huge one. I said earlier that a lot of these kids get very inflexible because it's just a way to impose order on their world, but it can be really maddening, right? So like recently I had a case where a little girl, came out of preschool. She was, her grandmother had picked her up, which she does every day, but her grandmother had actually parked in a different parking space because her parking space was not available. And this 4-year-old literally threw herself to the ground and is screaming at her grandmother that she has to move the space to the car that this child expected. Like, this is the level that it can get to. The thing is that this world doesn't adapt to us. We have to adapt to the world. So in a situation like that, what we do is, I know, sweetie, your brain had such a clear thought that this is what was going to happen. And it feels really uncomfortable when it doesn't happen that way. But I'm not going to move the car. And I know that you may not like that, but you'll be okay. And then you do it as calmly and lovingly as you can. You tolerate the upset. At some point, the child calms down, and now you've built some flexibility, because these kids have to live through the discomfort in order to come out the other side and see that they actually could survive something that they didn't think they could survive. And then we talked a little bit earlier about kids who are fearful and cautious. Again, you don't want to try and talk them out of their feelings. I use something called the worry and the thinking brain that I write a lot about, that you guys will get resources on, where I help kids, these highly reactive kids. The more you can give them tools to feel in control in a concrete way, the better. So I'll teach them that, like, oh, your worry brain, like a kid who didn't want to do swim lessons, but his parents knew that he would love to swim. And so we taught him about his worry and his thinking brain, went through all the worries he had, then recruited his thinking brain to think like, is the teacher really going to let him drown? They went to the swim class. They didn't force him to engage, but they did go. They said, we are going to the class. Once we're there, you decide how you're going to participate. It's your body. You need to decide. But by setting that boundary, that limit that we are going, enabled an amazing process to take place, which is slowly each week, as the child watched and saw that his worries weren't founded, he put a toe in the water, and by, the end of the 8 weeks, he was loving it, right? So with these fearful and cautious kids, you want to be sensitive, but you don't want to enable it. You don't want to just say, like, my kid doesn't like anything, so we're just not going to do anything. You want to pick one thing and then work it through in this way, because they need to work it through so that you can then, on the other side of it, now this child I was talking about with the swimming, now every time that happens, his parents are able to say, I know, bud, when there's something new, it feels really scary to you. And it feels really uncomfortable, and you just want to avoid it, because who wants to deal with something uncomfortable? Totally get it. But it's important to help you. This is an activity we are going to do. And remember the swimming. Remember what your worry brain was telling you, and what would have happened if we had just abandoned swimming. Like, look at what you would have missed out on. So we believe in you to muscle through this. So that's sort of what you want to be doing with fearful and cautious kids. And with perfectionism, you really want to avoid cheerleading and rushing to, like, oh, but you're like, I'm thinking of a kid recently who's, working a lot on handwriting, and he flipped out because his O wasn't the same as his dad's O. And, this parent's natural reaction was, oh, your O is amazing, or, oh, your drawing's amazing, or, oh, you're amazing at soccer. Like, we run to the rescue because we don't want our kids to feel uncomfortable. But the problem is then they don't have any chance to work it through, and they pick up on your anxiety, and they don't have a chance to actually feel comfortable with their own discomfort. So in those situations, I do something like this. I know your brain is telling you that the O should look this way, and it's really uncomfortable to you when it doesn't look that way. Totally get it. Let's think about it. And like, then you go through the reality testing. Let's say your dad is 42. So he's had like 42 years to work on this, and you're 6, so we do a lot of that, but we're never saying, like you should be happy with what you did. We just say, you think about it. It's your body, it's your brain. You have to think about what you want to do about this, because if you try and change it and make it all better, the child just shuts down and those interactions just amplify. Okay, so I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. This is all of my contact information, but I think you guys are going to get that maybe in the chat. I am going to send my slides, so you'll have all of this information. And I'm going to stop sharing. We're going to go into, I'm going to turn it back over, I think, to Denise to do the Q&A. And I just want to say quickly, when it comes to the Q&A, that I'm going to try and answer questions. I find in doing many of these sessions that I want my answers to be relevant to the largest group of people possible. And so I'm going to try and answer them more globally, like giving you some guiding principles. So like you listen, you people who are listening, you may not be dealing with that exact situation, but you'll get some more overarching ideas about how to deal with these tricky situations. Okay. Let's have at it, Denise.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much, Claire. We're getting a lot of real-time feedback that this is incredibly helpful to people and that it's really resonating with a lot of people. Probably, I would say, almost everyone on this in this Zoom meeting. So we have several questions. I'm going to start with one about siblings. Can you talk about parenting siblings when one is a big reactor? The person writes in says, I'm concerned that I'm spending so much more time supporting my orchid child at the expense of my dandelion children.
Yeah, so this is a biggie. Many, many families struggle with this. And here's what I would say. It is actually to your orchid child's benefit to not react and let him play that role of sucking all the oxygen out of the room. For many reasons that are probably obvious, but also for the sibling relationship, because you don't want the child who's the dandelion to have very negative feelings about his sibling because his sibling did take up so much space in the home. So it would be, you would be doing things like this. So your older child is, flying off the handle and, being, in an uncomfortable space when you really were reading a book to your other child. So it might look something like this. I'm going to call the older child Harry and the younger child, Sarah. So it would be like, Harry, I know you're having a really hard time now. You really want mommy's attention to help you with this. I totally get it. Right now, I am reading a book to Sarah. So you have two great choices. You can sit and listen with us, or I can help you be in a safe space in order for me to finish doing what I'm doing with Sarah. Like, you have to be willing to set limits you can actually follow through on, because what I see is like the big reactor, like pushing the other kid, out of your lap and doing things that make it really hard for you to be the parent you want to be to both kids. The limit is loving for the orchid kid. Remember what I said earlier, they're the kids who need the boundaries the most because they're so internally dysregulated. So you have to have a plan that you can implement. So it may be saying, no problem, I will help you. Remember, it's not punishment. Nothing I ever do is punishment, but I do believe that safe boundaried spaces are really important when you have a big reactor, because if you can't control the situation, like this older child is still screaming or like pushing the younger kid off your lap, then there's no way to control that situation. That's where I find saying to the orchid kid, I know you're having a rough moment. I totally get it. I need to finish what I'm doing here. So I'm going to help you take a safe space break. And the safe space can be their room. It should be filled with tons of things that they can do. It's not punishment, but you are setting a clear boundary that I'm not going to let you do that. Because remember, it's not good for that orchid child to be the lightning rod. It's not healthy for their self-esteem. So again, this is one of those scenarios where it feels mean, right? Because your child is not going to say, oh, thank you so much for helping me into my safe space. He may throw a tantrum for the full 20 minutes, but you come back and you're like, okay, bud, great job. I'm done doing this with Sarah. let's go do such and such. Like, that's where the resilience is built, that like all is still right with the world. I still love you. I stayed calm and in control. But if you don't have a clear boundary for those kids when they are really out of control, and by the way, like, I'm so in the weeds with families. These are things that happened in home visits, right? Like, all these families I work with are like, it's only time in, it's mean to kids, they shouldn't be by themselves, it's abandoning them, it's invalidating their feelings. Those are people who've never been in a home of a family where you have a really big reactor and they're hurling stuff across the room, or they're interfering in your other relationships. That's not healthy for anybody. You're not invalidating feelings. You're saying, I totally get it. This is a rough moment, but I need to do this right now. And so I'm going to help you be in your safe space. You may not like it. That's fine. But I'll be back in 15 minutes. And then I can't wait to read that story with you, or I can't wait to help you with that problem. If you do it that way, that is way more loving than getting into a knockdown, drag out battle with your orchid kid.
Thank you. Are kids who are big reactors more likely to develop a mental health issue?
Yes. I mean, temperament is a factor, and you can see why, as you listen and you hear the stories and you think about their wiring makes them more vulnerable, for sure, because emotional regulation is critical for mental health, right? And these kids are wired to just have a harder time with that. Also, you can see how I think from listening, that like these kids are much more prone to anxiety because they don't have that filter. They overthink everything. And they can often get themselves into a tizzy, which why you sometimes, I have a lot of parents who will come in and saying like, I think my child has OCD because like he's so controlling. If I don't do things, like I had a kid the other day where the dad was telling me that he had sang a funny song, like he had riffed on like Wheels on the Bus, and he changed it. And then the kid was like, daddy, 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 sing it again. And he couldn't recreate it. And the kid flipped out, like he couldn't handle that dad had gone off script, right? That's a moment where you need to say, I know, bud, your brain is just telling you it needs to be this way. I totally get it, but that can't happen. And I know it's really uncomfortable, but you'll be okay. Like, that's why I work so intensively with parents early on, because if you can react in those ways, it can reduce the anxiety, because what we don't want is to bring our anxiety to the table. That's why you hear me talking a lot about managing our own emotions, sharing our calm with them. But you can only do that, like, remember, if you have an end game, right? That's when things spiral out of control. If you don't have the end game, the calm is what your child needs. That's why all these sort of strategies and mind shifts fit together. But I mean, the short answer is yes. But the good news is there is a lot you can do as a parent to not get reactive, right? Because remember, when you go in and cheerlead your child out of their fears, it doesn't make the fears go away. It makes the child feel like the fears are not okay and that the parent's uncomfortable with them, and the fears magnify, right? Or the parent keeps letting the kid stay in the bed. And what happens then is the child, like the message to the child is, remember, that's another one of those things like, oh, it's not loving to not let my child be in my bed because he doesn't want to be alone in his room at night. But what you're actually saying to your child is, you're right. Like, you're not safe in your room alone. You need to be with us. You see, so you can see how the anxiety just sort of snowballs. So that is the trickiest thing about parenting these kids, is that it's the limits that are loving, because it provides experience for the child to see, I survived something I didn't think I could survive. When they wake up that first morning and all is right with the world and mom and dad are still there, that's where the resilience is built and the anxiety gets reduced.
Well, Claire, we have had questions about the shifting parent mindsets, and you've talked a lot about that. Is there anything else you wanted to add about how parents can make that shift? Because as you've mentioned, it's so hard when you're in the moment, and you're being triggered, the child's being triggered. And so how can a parent get their in a better way and for their own emotional health as well.
Yeah. Well, that's where that taking the mommy daddy moment is critical. And I'm going to give you like a little bit of an adaptation that I find really helpful. Is so your child, you're feeling yourself getting triggered. Of course, that's the first and most important thing. That's where, like, so many parents I work with have read all the books on mindfulness. They know about taking deep breaths, but when push comes to shove, it's just not enough. That's why I came up with this, like, just state what's in front of you, right? I've asked you to get ready for bed, to put on your pajamas. You're having a really hard time doing that. We're going to take a mommy daddy. We're going to have a mommy daddy meeting so we can figure out how we're going to help you with this. That throws a monkey wrench into the process and gives the parent a minute to think about what are our choices in this situation, right? Like, you can't make your child get dressed. They're a human being. If your whole focus is on bribing, threatening, offering rewards for your child to get dressed, remember, you're back in gray zone. They're in control. Things go off the rails. This gives you time to say, what are our two great choices? We can't make him get dressed. So it could be, Bud, we're going to give you this 10-minute period to get ready. And this is what you're mulling over when you're having your meeting. And by the way, if you can do it in front of your kid, it's very powerful, right? So you stay in the room and you literally do something like this, like, Dad, so let's see, Henry is a human being, right? So we can't actually make him get dressed, right? Like, only he can choose if he's going to get dressed or not. So I guess his two great choices be he just goes to sleep in what he's wearing, or he lets us help him get dressed. That's it. But after the 10 minutes are done, we're going on to book reading. And then you set a limit that you can actually implement and you just move on. You don't get caught in that gray zone. And so having that meeting time is critically important because it enables you to think clearly about what your plan is going to be. Like that grandmother in the parking lot, like, she was completely freaked out about what to do with this toddler. And she felt like it was being mean to not literally get in her car and move it. So I pulled her aside in front of the toddler and I was completely empathetic. You know, Matilda's having a really hard time right now. She, her brain was saying you were going to be in that spot and it's really uncomfortable. Totally get it. But, Matilda can handle it. It's the same car, you're the same grandma, and she'll be okay. So we gave her the two great choices. She could not even process it, right? She's like in the middle of the parking lot. So grandma picked her up and got her into the car seat, and she eventually calmed and they were able to move on in a positive way. But you need to take that pause so you can go through the process of saying, what in this little scenario do I control and not control? And stay focused on what you can control to validate and be totally loving and supportive while helping your child move on in a positive way. And that's the one thing I have found that can actually really help. The other thing is taking your own break. And it's very healthy to say to a child, oh, wow, Mom, I feel like I'm sort of losing control. I'm a little bit in red zone. So I'm going to take a mommy break so I can calm myself, so I can be your helper. And you go into another room. And if your child is literally banging, because this happens, like if your child's banging on the door the whole time, okay, they will survive that. You calm yourself. You say, what are my choices in this situation? What can I control so I can stay in charge in a positive way? And then you come out, and even if she's been screaming and banging on the door, you come out and you say, okay, Mommy had her time to think. You don't have to, not only do you not have to react to everything, it's not helpful to react to everything. Remember, that upset is not harmful to her, right? She now lived through you being away from her for 2 minutes, calmly thinking about what you were going to do, and come out and be the best mom she needs you to be in that moment. Remember, she's not going to like the limit. Don't expect her to like your limit, but come out with a clear idea about what those two choices are. Remember, choice one is always the right thing, right? Like, I've got a lot of families apoplectic over kids not agreeing to wash their hands, right? And they're getting into knockdown, drag out battles, literally, with their kids. So, because they're trying to bribe, cajole, reward them to get them right to wash their hands when they come home from school. So in this model, you would say, okay, what are, like, I can't make you, and you say this in front of them. It's very powerful to put it out there. Like, I can't make you wash your hands. Like, you're a human being. I can't make you do that. So your two great choices are you stay in charge, because you want to, you use your words really carefully. Like, these kids want to be in charge. So you want to be in charge. You can choose a sink and wash your hands. That's one great option, right? That's always the right. Option two is I'll hold you. I'll take an antibacterial wipe. It might feel really uncomfortable to both of us, but your hands need to be cleaned. That is a have to. How it happens is completely up to you. You decide. So the optics are very much like, you're the decider. I'm just letting you know what your options are, but you have to have an end game, because otherwise you are down that rabbit hole of bribing, cajoling. I can't help but give you like a great most recent example. There was a little girl, their parents are working at home. It's the afternoon. She's come back from school, and mom is on a very important Zoom call. And they've told her, like, mommy can't be disturbed, right? And it's upstairs. So the dad starts saying, remember, you're not allowed to go bother mommy. And you've got this mischievous 5-year-old, like literally walking backwards up the stairs with that grin on her, mischievous grin. And the dad's going, remember, if you do that, there's not going to be any TV later. And she literally looks at him and says, I don't care about TV. And she turns around and she runs right into mom's room, right? Like, that is a classic example of not having a limit you can implement. The redo is this: sweetie, I know it's really hard. It's hard to have mommy home and not to be able to see her. We totally get it. And we know that you don't like our rule, but we're going to put a timer on so you'll know exactly how long mommy's going to be gone. And I'm going to put a gate at the bottom of the stairs, and we are going to go into this room to help you follow the rule. You have to have some kind of limit that you control. And for this girl, what happened the next time? He went into a room, he closed and locked the door, and he just started playing, and she's freaking out. I have to see mommy. I can't live if I can't see mommy, all of that sort of vitriol, histrionics. And the dad just stayed calm. I know it's really hard. I'm going to go over here and build a tower. I can't wait for you to join me when you're ready. They just need you to be their rock. That is not detrimental to that child. And it was such a wonderful learning opportunity, because she had a fit for quite a while. The dad stayed calm. He didn't try and talk her out of it. He didn't say how great what they were playing was going to be and how she should be so happy that daddy's, making a tower with her. He simply said, I'm here for you. I'm going to be doing this when you're ready. I can't wait for you to join me. She has her meltdown. She eventually calms. They end up playing. Mom comes out, and great job following the rules, sweetie. Really pouring it on that she survived, right? That's what these kids need, because in those moments, I believe, like, they're not play acting. In that moment, that child felt very distressed, because her association is like, I have to see mommy. I can't survive without her. But that's not healthy for a child, right? Like, what we're angling for with these kids is to be able to feel safe and secure in your relationship without having that parent directly in front of you. And that's exactly what she learned, right? She was able to tolerate the limit, and mom reappeared, and she now built some resilience, and she also started trusting her parents' rules. And that is what was huge, because think about it. Kids, the reason kids are often superstars at school and monsters, as parents say, at home, is because in school, there is no gray zone. It's not like a kid's like negotiating, are we going to spend 10 more minutes playing outside, or I don't like this snack and I actually want cheese crackers. Like, the limits are so clear, it makes them feel calm and secure. They know exactly what to expect, and they adapt. And the more parents can do that for their kids at home, the smoother things go. And these kids do start to manage their big emotions and become more flexible. So I guess what I would say, Denise, in summary, is that the payoff is huge. So, like, you want to remember this conversation, and the next time your kid triggers you, oh, this is a hard moment. Even if you can't sportscast, this is a hard moment. Yeah, I'm going to take a mommy moment to calm myself so I can think about how I can help us solve this problem. And then you think of, what do I control? And then you come up with a plan you can implement that helps you stay in charge, because it's when you lose control as a parent that is when things go off the rails and you are the parent you don't want to be, and then you go to bed at night super contrite because you feel like all you've done is yelled and screamed and had protracted power struggles with your kid.
Well, Claire, thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned that, and that segues into a couple other things. And we do want to start to wrap up. So I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions and take just a few more minutes. And I apologize, we probably will not get to all the questions tonight, because there's a lot of great questions. But I'm going to combine two questions here. One is, I'm glad you mentioned like taking the mommy time, because sometimes there isn't another parent in this, and it's a single parent, and that makes it that much tougher, and they need to be able to deal with this on their own. But my dual question is, what happens when parents disagree about what's going on with a highly sensitive child and how to deal with it? And also what happens with when a child has multiple caretakers and there's no consistent approach? And I don't know if maybe your answers will be different for both of those, but if you could sort of briefly attack both of those from both angles.
Well, I deal with that quite a bit. And so here's what I would say I find most helpful is you come at it from not like who's right or wrong or whose methodology is better. Usually I find that, especially with couples, that it's a little bit of both, right? Like one parent is like being what we think of permissive, like very social, emotionally connected, but not setting clear limits. And the other parent is like hardline, right? And really with the child. So what I do is I come at it from the child's perspective. So I say, here's what we know about highly sensitive kids and what they need and why. And it's not strategic to get shaming and threatening, because it only amplifies the dysregulation that the child is already experiencing internally, right? So I come at it from a very logical perspective that like, I'm not on anybody's side. And that's what I would say to parents, like, let's think about our child and like what she's telling us and what she needs. And what does she need from both of us? And how can we come together, not to prove, it's not like a Sunday talk show where you're sitting there, like just, starting here and then you end up here because you're just defending your position. That's something that is usually very unhealthy and only causes more stress in couples. I really encourage couples to think about what are they learning about their child. Read some of these articles. I've got lots of articles about highly sensitive kids, and it takes that very logical approach. Like, you may think this is misbehavior, but here's what happens when you react in a punitive, harsh way. So that's just not strategic. So I try and look at it from, what does this child need and how can we both do that? How can we both give her that, right? So I know, like, I'm very aware, even as I'm saying this, that like there's probably a lot of yes buts. And that's the hard part about a platform like this, is that it's hard to know exactly what's going on in that couple, but that's the most important thing, is that you focus on the child and that's what you both really care about. And it's not about who's right or wrong. And then I would say with caregivers, I do a lot of this kind of thing. Like, I totally get it, that you feel like this is, you have to start by validating their perspective. Nobody is going to listen to what you have to say if you haven't first acknowledged it, right? So you might say, like, I totally get that you feel that this is what's going to be most helpful to her. And I totally understand that, but this is what we're learning about our child. This is what we're understanding. So like, this happens a lot where like a caregiver just like wants to force potty training, right? They're like, your child's ready. And then they're doing all these things like making them sit on the potty. A lot of things that really backfire with these kids, right? Because the more you try and force it, the more they dig in their heels. And so it might sound something like this, like, I totally get it, but we're learning a lot about Melissa. And in fact, the more we like force and try and make her do things, the less likely she is to do it. And she really needs consistency from us. That's the most important thing, is that you start by validating their perspective, because if they feel like they haven't been heard, or you're just schooling them or criticizing them, they're human beings too, and they shut down, right? And then it becomes almost like another power struggle, each party trying to prove the rightness of their situation. So I do this a lot I have a lot of families who have big challenges with their in-laws. like family vacations are deadly because their kid is the big reactor and the cousins are happily playing and adapting. And it's really, really tough for these parents. And I do a lot of work with them on how to talk to their own parents about these kinds of things. Like, I know you feel like we're not being strict enough with Harry. I totally get it. I totally see why you would see that. Let us explain what we're learning about him and why we're doing what we're doing, like why we are showing empathy and compassion while still setting limits. So, and it always starts with that validation, because otherwise you're nowhere. That, I would say, is the most important first step.
Thank you. One last question. If you could briefly talk about the language, the good language to use when validating and communicating boundaries to highly sensitive older children and teens.
So, I don't see it as that different. Like with an older teen, like I'm thinking about my kids when they were in their teens. I'll never forget my son was 13 and he had some like cockamamie idea that like he was going to go to some girl's house and at 9 o'clock, literally, I'm not kidding you, like, because that was his spot. I didn't know what that was about, but clearly, I said, that's not going to happen. And he exploded. And, I hate you, all the vitriol, and I completely mishandled it. So the new me, unfortunately, it took many, many years for me to sort of learn all this and get with the program, would be something like this. Like, Sam, I totally get it. I totally understand why you would want to do that. And I'm not like trying to convince you to like my rule, but I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with you going to a girl's house at 9 o'clock at night. I'm happy to help you make a plan another time of day. If you need to be mad at me, it's totally fine. It's totally fine. But I'm always going to make a decision that's going to make you feel safe. So really, when it comes to like any child, but especially teenagers, it's really getting comfortable with not being liked and being hate. Of course, they don't hate you, but that's what they say. They say very triggering things to derail you, to get you to change your mind. That's what these very highly sensitive, fierce kids do. So a lot of it is tolerating their distress. And like they go in their room and they slam the door, no problem. They need the same thing as the younger kids. I'm your rock. You can be mad at me. I'm not mad back at you. That's what you want to avoid, right? It's like, I get it. You're not liking my rule. I'm going to go watch this movie. I'd love for you to come join me if you're ready. You then just give them space. They need that space to be unhappy, to not like your rule. But the more you can do that, the more they will respect you, and they will come to see that, like, when you do set a limit, it holds. It's when you keep flip-flopping or they're able to bargain and negotiate out of it that things really become problematic. So I strongly suggest to parents of older kids, and actually really younger kids too, is when your child comes to you with a question, you don't have to answer it right away. I would get used to saying, I hear your question. Like for a younger kid, it might be like, can we have movie night tonight? Or can we go to the playground today? And for an older kid, it might be, can I go to the mall with my friends? Or, can I watch this R-rated movie? You say, you know what? I hear you. I need a mommy or daddy minute to think about my answer. It's a really good question and I respect it. And so I want to be thoughtful about it. So you're modeling, right? Non-reactivity. And you need time. Otherwise, you're just going to be reactive. You think it through. If you have a partner, you might think it through with them, especially if you have kids who like triangulate and go to the parent, after one parent says no, they go to the other parent. Like that's a whole nother story, but that's not healthy. That's why this model works really well. Like the kid comes to you and you say, okay, I'm going to go talk to mommy about that. Oh, I've already talked to mom. That's okay. Like we're a team. I'm going to go talk to mommy and we're going to think about the answer to your question. Give yourself time. And then trust it. Like what I say to parents is pause and say, if your best friend told you this is what they were doing in that situation and you thought it was a really good idea in the abstract, trust it and do it. Don't fear. When I say don't fear the tantrum, it's the same thing for 13, 14, 15-year-olds. They have their own version of tantrums. They make threats, I'm never going to do this. I know. you're really mad about it, no problem. Like, you just want to stick with it, show total compassion. Don't try and get them. If they sense that you want their buy-in, you are lost, because they will exploit that, right? If they sense that you're trying to convince them to like their rule, right? Like if I was saying to my son, oh, honey, don't you think it's sort of inappropriate at 13 to have like, you know, then he's going to argue that ad nauseum, because no, actually, mom, I actually think it's okay. She's a really good girl and I really like her. Like, you're nowhere in that situation. So you really want to hear your child out, ask all the questions, then tell me more about it. What are you going to do? What? Okay, great. I've got all the information. I'm going to talk to mommy and we will come back with our answer, and then stick to it. Just stick to it and tolerate the upset. You see, it's not that different. It's like that, even though my book is, the cases in it are geared to younger kids, because that's the majority of my practice. I've had so many families read it with older kids, and the same rules apply.
Wow. Well, I feel like we could talk all night long, but I'm sure that you have things to do, Claire, and the rest of us, we're just going to wrap up right now. And I would say to everyone to please check out Claire's book. Please check out her website. I assume I didn't check the chat box, but her website is in the chat for everyone. And I know that there are a lot of resources there that could be very helpful to everyone on in this meeting. So thank you so much, Claire, for being with us tonight and for all your incredible advice.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Denise, for moderating. And Claire, this resonated with all of us, whether we have orchids or dandelions or a combination of the two. And it was a fantastic talk, and we got a lot of great questions. And sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but hopefully you can find some helpful resources on Claire's website as well. I just want to make a plug to please mark your calendars for our next event on November 17th with Cara Natterson. She'll be speaking on the topic of preparing for and surviving puberty. I hope you can all join us then. And thank you once again for joining us tonight. Thank you, Claire, so much. Appreciate it.
Okay, have a good night, everyone. And kudos to all you parents who stayed on. Your kids are really lucky. If you're still on at 8:29 when you could be having a glass of wine and watching like Succession, it means that you really want to keep learning and growing. And like, that's perfect parenting to me, honestly.
Thank you, Claire. It was so great.